Good evening, this is Goldie. It's Wednesday, July 28th, 2010. I'm again transmitting from a secure location with a live studio audience, over which I have no control. Please become a follower of mine on Ustream. Please note that I will be doing the next show from this secure location and will not be able to be sending email alerts, only Facebook alerts. But the non-rant will be happening at 6 o'clock Central next Wednesday. By the way, I have someone monitoring. No, I don't. I figured out that this rant is really good for me to be doing, and I really appreciate and need your input after each rant with whatever issues, or especially disagreements you may have with me concerning these topics. As to the method that I'm using today, it's basically me reading prepared material and maybe a later question session with my live studio audience, related or unrelated to today's topics. The actual ranting that I do is usually between the rant episodes and is freeform. However, for this show to be coherent at all, the method here is to present and expand with pre-written remarks. Let me summarize what I'll be talking about today. I'll be saying that we are worse off to effect structural regulatory change to protect the Gulf of Mexico because BP has capped the spill. I will be talking about how the same structural defect that allows BP to write its own regulations is at work in the financial reform legislation recently passed, and especially the exemption for auto dealers. I'll be talking about how boycotts in certain circumstances don't work. I'll be talking about how corporate interests and the U.S. interests have diverged over time and are no longer aligned. I will be talking about the revolving door of regulators into industry and back again. I'll be talking about MoveOn.org's agreement with me on the need for a constitutional amendment to say that corporations are not people. I will be agreeing with the Republicans' argument that regulations are profit and job killers, with the example of East 11th Street and East 12th Street in Austin, Texas, having onerous and duplicative regulations as to land use. Finally, I will go to our email bag and clarify some past rants with some new critiques from my listeners. Let me start with BP. According to a July 27, 2010 article in the New York Times entitled, "On the Surface, Gulf Oil Spill is Vanishing Fast. Concerns Stay," the oil slick appears to be vanishing. The cap that's on the well appears to be holding. While I'm happy in a small way, I'm deeply saddened that the well did not continue to gush through the November elections and beyond, at least until the beginning of the next session with the newbie legislators. We had a perfect storm in the continuous oil gushing, kind of like a continuous 9/11 disaster. Everyone saw it, especially on Fox News, and everyone had an opinion about it. Almost everyone thought BP was evil and may have been mobilized for some actual change. I have been proposing constitutional amendments for weeks to fix the structural regulatory defect that caused the disaster. See my BP rants 1 through 4 that are on Ustream. And then they fixed the leak, temporarily by the way, and it's off the front page. Since Americans' brains are too small to think about any one thing that is not crammed down their throats, think constant video oil spill on TV, they just move on to the next Lindsay Lohan drugstore. Be a little happy and very, very sad, as the big chance may go away unless MoveOn.org and I act very quickly, very, very quickly, while people still remember the oil gushing. Let me talk about the BP boycott movement for a second. I just had a conversation about boycotting BP, and I've come to the conclusion that a boycott is misguided in this instance. If you drive past a BP station and go down the road to a Shell station, bypassing Exxon because of the Valdez disaster in Alaska, you're putting the same oil in your tank. Think about it. It's the same oil. There is no effect on the price or demand for oil. In fact, if you have to go farther out of your way to go to a Shell station, you've helped BP and Exxon by burning more gas and raising the demand and price for a barrel of oil. It has no effect on the major shareholders in BP, as they own shares in all of the oil companies, not just BP or Exxon, so they profit from their Shell stock. I guess you may hurt the employees' bonuses, and that's okay if that's what you're trying to do. But if you're trying to hurt BP by not buying their gas, you're wasting your limited energy. In fact, If a boycott forces BP into bankruptcy, the liability of the cost of the cleanup could be discharged, leaving the taxpayers of the U.S. holding the bag. Boycotting BP may make you feel better, like you're doing something to help, but I'd prefer that you work on the constitutional amendment that would overturn the Citizens United case and keep BP and Exxon from donating to senatorial and House races that allow them to continue writing their own regulations. For example, the fake island in the Beaufort Sea in the Arctic that is allowing BP to bypass offshore regulations by drilling onshore on this 32-acre BP-made island. They built their own island. If that's not a structural regulatory failure, then I don't know what is. Related to BP and continuing on last week's discussion of American imperialism, through talks with some friends in my secure location, I want to change the phrase of the current state of American imperialism to corporate imperialism. In other words, in the old days of, say, Teddy Roosevelt, the U.S. used its influence in armed forces to take whatever it wanted. Countries, oil, resources, Cuba. The corporate interests that donated to legislators' coffers were almost wholly owned within the United States. So the boundaries of the United States coincided with the boundaries of the corporations, except for mineral extractions overseas and labor exploitation wherever there was cheap labor. Today, the national boundaries for corporations do not exist. Therefore, the interests of the corporations in the United States do not coincide, at least as much as they did in the good old days. I had a bit of an argument with one friend about whether Exxon is a U.S. corporation. I said that since I didn't know the shareholder makeup or director makeup, I could not comment on whether they are a U.S. corporation or not. But that if the Chinese own 60% of Exxon, then it wouldn't be a U.S. corporation. He said that since most of the major decisions are made in the global headquarters, which is located in the U.S., then it's a U.S. corporation. For purposes of my rants, that is not a relevant distinction, as it's clear that if the U.S. makes drilling in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico too onerous, the corporations will just drill off the coast of a more welcoming country. Well, wouldn't a U.S. corporation want to drill where we, the U.S., own the oil? And don't we, the citizens of the U.S., want the U.S. corporations to drill here and lessen our dependence on foreign oil? That is certainly not borne out by experience. Exxon's employees are all over the world. Numerous subsidiaries somewhat autonomously make decisions for the profitability of the parent, but they also have an interest in the country of their production of profits. So the Chinese operating subsidiary of Exxon has a very different view of U.S.-Chinese relations than the U.S. operating subsidiary of Exxon. The parent corporation of both subs then makes a risk assessment and profitability determination on any potential investment, ignoring the interests of the United States. Why would they do anything else? Why? So if they ignore, we'll answer later. So if they ignore the interests of the U.S. in making that determination, again, if they ignore the interests of the U.S. in making that determination, are they a U.S. corporation just because that decision was made in Houston, Texas? I don't think so. Staying with the regulation theme, but moving to the structural defect in our system, a July 27, 2010 New York Times article entitled "Ex-Regulators Get Set to Lobby on New Financial Rules" is a further case in point about financial services regulation and rulemaking. I would have called the article "Ex-Regulators Get Set to Lobby Current Regulators on New Financial Rules." Listen to that more correct title. Ex-regulators get set to lobby current regulators on new financial rules. Because the revolving door is in full force in Washington with its hands in our pockets. That's really what we're seeing there, is that revolving door. Just look at the opportunities for the lobbyists as shown in the article. And I quote, "Lobbying and law firms here have always turned to former regulators to navigate the bureaucracies of Washington. But the financial regulations passed by Congress and signed into law by President Obama have left most of the real decision-making to the SEC and other agencies, making these agencies more powerful than ever. On a scale that analysts say that they have never seen, government regulatory agencies will spend the coming years enacting rules on everything from the definition of a systemically important mega bank to limits on debit card fees. Federal agencies will decide the details of at least 243 financial rules and conduct 67 studies, according to an assessment by the Davis Polk Law Firm. The SEC alone is responsible for developing 95 rules on topics like the trading of derivatives, standards for credit rating agencies, and disclosure of executive bonuses. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission must develop 61 rules. The Federal Reserve has 54, and two agencies just created by Congress, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Financial Stability Oversight Council, have 80 rules between them. Credit card companies will look to maintain higher fees on debit cards. Derivatives investors will seek to define themselves as end users of a particular product who should be exempted from some restrictions. Niche industries like payday lenders and check cashing services will push for less burdensome federal regulation. And in many cases, the industries will rely on former regulators to make their cases to the federal agencies. This is how it works in every industry that is regulated by the U.S. government. The revolving door for regulators to corporations and back again swings fast, hard, and costs us, the taxpayers, trillions of dollars and loss of our precious commons, which is the point of regulating in the first place. An example of one of the scam exemptions in the actual financial services bill, and not the rulemaking at the agency level, was the exemption to the auto dealers. As I was reading the New York Times the day after last week's rant, after I had complained about the regulatory defect of the auto dealer exemption from the financial reform bill, I saw that taxpayer-owned GM bought a subprime lender. Just think, we allowed a taxpayer-funded company to lobby and donate to political campaigns to get an exemption so that they can bait and switch you, the car buyer, with the financing for the car. That's what the exemption is. Then they use taxpayer funds to buy a subprime lender, which is defined as a lender that makes loans to people that have bad credit scores and can't afford to pay back the loan. I hate to repeat myself, but I must. We allowed a taxpayer-funded company to lobby and donate to political campaigns to get an exemption so that they can bait and switch you, the car buyer, with the financing for the car. Then they use taxpayer funds to buy a subprime lender, which is defined as a lender that makes loans to people that have bad credit scores and can't afford to pay back the loan. Thank you. So GM lobbied first, then took advantage of the regulation that they wrote, which will further exacerbate the entire cycle of loan defaults from the last 2 years. And we are the owners of GM. Don't tell me that we are not a stupid, ignorant people. Okay, before you shoot yourself in the head thinking that nothing can be changed, listen up. As to the structural defect that allowed the BP disaster to happen and will allow them to happen in the future, and the structural defect that allowed lenders to play with taxpayer-backed funds to create exotic instruments, including subprime loans for cars, I received an email from MoveOn.org on July 22nd, 2010, entitled, "Corporations Are Not People, Sign the Pledge." In it, and this brings tears to my eyes, they're calling for a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, amend the Constitution to protect America from unlimited corporate spending on our elections by overturning the Supreme Court's decision, giving corporations the same First Amendment rights as people. Second, fair elections now. Pass the Fair Elections Now Act, providing public financing to candidates who are supported by small donors so they can compete with corporate-backed and self-funded candidates. And the Lobbyist Reform Act passed legislation to end the overwhelming influence of corporate lobbyists by prohibiting individuals from switching from corporate lobbying to government service or vice versa within a 5-year period, stopping corporate lobbyists from giving gifts and providing free travel to government officials, and posting online the attendees and content of all meetings between lobbyists and government officials. Remember my proposed constitutional amendments over the past 7 weeks? Yes. Number 1, term limits for congressmen and senators. Number 2, an entity is not a person entitled to free speech rights, Citizens United case. Number 3, only individual unions can donate to political campaigns and drastically limit those donation amounts. And 4, no revolving door for employment from government employment to any entity, union, corporation, affiliation, individual, or group that lobbies any governmental agency. I say again, I have serious tears in my eyes. Our main difference is that Move On believes the election donation issue and lobbyist influence structural defects can be handled legislatively. I don't. We need constitutional amendments for these items so that they just won't be overturned by the next Republican majority with the approval of complacent and bought and paid for Democrats as well. In any event, please go to moveon.org and sign that petition. I still cannot believe that someone is already putting in the major work that I've been discussing over the past several months. You should feel very good about that, as I do. As to the rest of the stuff that Move On does, I have no opinion, as they were pro-Obama and Democratic Party during the last election. Anybody have any questions? The 9/11 reference, that's a good question. What I say about that is that my point is that everybody has an opinion about the oil spill. Just like everybody had an opinion about 9/11. You could walk up to people in the store, tap on their shoulder and go, isn't that oil gusher terrible? Wasn't the attack on the Twin Towers terrible? It was a different type of cultural phenomenon where you could walk up to a complete stranger and talk about that issue. Probably around the world.
You believe it's not polarizing?
No, I believe it's that ubiquitous. You see it everywhere. You see it gushing from Fox all the time. So when we have those kind of items, that's when, since everybody is discussing it and has an opinion about it, maybe you can get some change. Now the gusher's gone, we may have blown our chance. Thank you. All right, I want to comment a bit on onerous regulations, since it sounds like I'm all for regulations. I am for regulating and enforcing the regulations of the commons, defined by Goldy as air, land, water, offshore drilling, and the day-to-day banking industry. However, the anti-regulation people are correct in saying that regulations cost money and jobs. Regulations always do cost money and jobs, as a regulation is a restriction. There may be long-term profitable regulations, but shareholders demand what the profits are in this fiscal quarter. Inefficient regulations, which we currently have, may not even protect the commons at all. Let me give you a textbook example of inefficient regulations unrelated to BP. On East 11th Street and East 12th Street in Austin, the area was traditionally and predominantly black and Hispanic due to racist deed restrictions on the west side of Austin that pushed all of those people to the east side. East 11th and 12th became vibrant centers of black culture and commerce. When these racist deed restrictions were made illegal and freedom of housing occurred, a lot of those minority families moved to the suburbs where there were better schools, leaving behind dilapidated structures that became havens for drugs and prostitution. Late in the 1990s, the city of Austin applied for and received a designation of slum and blight that allowed creation of the boundaries for an urban renewal area. In an urban renewal area, a plan for development is decreed, supposedly with input from all stakeholders. Each property within the urban renewal area is then micromanaged as to its use, contrary to normal areas where there is a zoning category that allows multiple uses, and the landowner then picks among them. So each of these properties has a base zoning, an urban renewal plan designation, and on top of that, there was created an NCCD, which is a neighborhood combining conservation district, with additional restrictions and prohibited uses that supposedly was created with input from the stakeholders. Then came the real estate crash of 2008. Now the residents and business owners are wondering why there's no development, besides the fact that there's no significant new developments going on anywhere in Austin. Well, I can tell you why there's nothing going on over on East 12th Street. It's the onerous extra layers of bureaucracy and the almost impossibility of getting a variance from all of the regulations. Turns out most real estate deals require variances, as micromanaging real estate uses rarely works in the real world. The city recently held a town hall meeting about East Side development, and I continued to ask, who believes that the extra layers of restrictions make it easier to develop on 12th? I get crickets for an answer. I'm not even calling for the elimination of the restrictions. I'm calling for the elimination of the urban renewal plan and the taking of the land use restrictions out of the urban renewal plan and attaching them to the NCCD. So they're all in one place, able to be modified like any other property in Austin, Texas. I know this example is a bit specific for my point that onerous and inefficient regulations cost jobs and profits, but it is a clear local example of where this is absolutely true. Are there any questions from the audience? Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you explain to me the connection between beat and the Jimmy legs and the Hoppy Skip dance?
Okay.
And if any of them relate to the other?
Thank you. Apparently, we let some alcohol into the studio audience today. We're going to be answering that one in the later Thunder round.
Okay.
I got one more. I'll read it to you when I hear it.
BP stock has been going down steadily, yet they are still recording Q2 huge profits. So I have a two-part question, okay?
Okay, hang on. BP's stock has been
stock is
declining
going
steadily, but their profits are...
Their profits are still recording billion-dollar profits.
Okay, they're still recording some large profits. Okay, go.
Billion-dollar profits. So two-part question.
Two-part question.
First part, should BP be allowed to record billion-dollar profits while the U.S. workers and fishermen lose wages?
Okay, first question. Let's do the first question first. Okay.
Okay.
Should BP be allowed to
still
make?
record billion-dollar profits while there's still so many wages in the state?
Yes. The question is, should BP be allowed to make these profits while there are fishermen that are dying on the vine? And as I have said in the prior BP rants, the most important thing for the efficiency of the system that even allows us to be sitting here drinking rum and cokes and on this computer doing this rant is we want corporations to maximize their profits. Now, under the law and the regulations under the law, it is our duty, the taxpayers' duty, to properly regulate. So yes, we need BP to make profits, by the way, to pay the unlimited sums that they're required to pay for the cleanup. So yes, they should absolutely be recording profits. We do not want them to go out of business. We need to properly regulate them. Second question.
Now that BP stock is low, if I buy BP stock right now, does that make me evil?
Now that BP stock is low, if he buys it, does it make him evil? Absolutely not. Thank you for your questions.
And a related question.
Okay, there's a related
Is this a good time to buy BP stock?
I don't have an answer for you. Is it a good time to buy BP stock? I answered, I don't know.
And your answer to the previous question was that it should be regulated properly. How do you define properly?
Well, this is what we've been talking, his question is how do you define properly? And all of the things that I have been talking about with the structural regulatory defects are going to lead to the proper way to regulate. Under our current system, we cannot properly regulate. It cannot be done.
But what is proper regulation?
I don't know what that is. I just know that we don't even have the structure of regulation set up to even then go on to the next step and go, should we have relief wells when they drill a well? Should we have the billion-dollar cleanup thing ready to go? Should we have the cap? We don't know what the proper thing is because we don't even have the structure to regulate it correctly. You're bringing up points that are perfectly valid following the structural change. Without the structural change, I have absolutely no idea.
That's my two-part question.
What is the structure that is required to properly regulate without becoming a bureaucratic burden on it?
But this is what we've been discussing over the past few weeks, so I'm going to move on for now. Thank you very much for your questions. Appreciate it.
You haven't answered evil. Am I evil?
No, I said you are not evil for buying stock. In fact, if it's low and it's profitable, I would buy BP stock. Nothing evil at all in it. In fact, there is no such thing as an evil corporation. Okay. Pardon. Moving on to Arizona, who I love, honor, and respect. Since a federal judge today put on hold several key parts in the Arizona immigration law, I would like to bring up a question from a buddy who's doing a little tech support for me and set up the show. What is the difference between racial profiling that is bad and racial profiling that is good? Or as I like to phrase it, is there ever a case where racial profiling is good? The example that was used in a local Austin letter to the editor was this. A bank robber is reported to be black. Would you stop any white people? That was the question that the letter writer wrote. Since if you only stop black people, you're obviously racially profiling, which as Goldie says, is bad. Well, I consider the question ridiculous and not a part of my definition of racial profiling. Let me reiterate. I don't ever want our great country to be a country where we differentiate between people on the basis of their color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, or otherwise. As I've said over and over again, I don't want to be asked, where are your papers, unless I've done something wrong. Thank God, in Arizona, Judge Susan Bolton, who will be called by Republicans and Fox News an activist judge, look for it, she declared the asking of, "Where are your papers?" to be off limits. The message that I predict you will now be hearing will be, and listen to this, she unconstitutionally held parts unconstitutional. I know it's a mouthful, but that is going to be the Fox and Republican message between now and the election, since the case won't be decided by the Supreme Court until after the election. So again, you're going to hear this message. She unconstitutionally held parts unconstitutional. And you know what? Fox listeners are going to buy it. I'm going to hear it. Do we have any questions about that? Anything on immigration, racial profiling?
No, it's pretty straightforward.
Thanks for giving them the food. Okay. I'm going to do a couple of email questions that I got from an old friend in Houston quoting me in my healthcare rant. This is the quote. The most difficult issue Goldy raises may be the conflict between personal freedom and personal responsibility. If I'm part of a group that pays premiums and collects after accidents, then my behavior affects the overall cost to others. So others have an interest in my risky behavior, legitimately, and may charge me higher premiums. If I don't like it, I can withdraw from the group. But if I have no choice about being in that group because the government arranges it and mandates my membership, then I have to insist also that my choice to take personal risks cannot be infringed. For that, I need a constitutional amendment. Again, this is my friend saying it. Recognizing my personal sovereignty over my own health and safety decisions. The legitimate desire for healthy people cannot trump the freedom of the individual to be intentionally unhealthy. Now, as I stated in my healthcare rant, if an uninsured person today has their leg cut off, they'll get a tourniquet and care at any hospital in the country. The same will be true when all of the healthcare reforms kick in. So by definition, there will be cases when even a person that does not want care will get it. How do we not make them chip in against this risk? That is all that the mandate or requirement of participation actually is. He further writes about my economic collapse rant and the declining standard of living in this country. And this was in quotes, if the nation's biggest creditor, China, calls in the loans, and then he comments, I'm not sure, but I think the Social Security Trust Fund is our federal government's biggest creditor. And I'm responding, I would hope that since I used anecdotal evidence of China being the holder of the largest amount of U.S. treasuries, that I could call them the largest U.S. creditor. I still do. And in my healthcare rant, I stated that I do not believe that services, Social Security, healthcare, pensions, will actually be there in a few years. So the government will just cut Social Security. That is not what a creditor like China would do. So I don't really consider them the same. The U.S. government is not a creditor. My personal responsibility rant to all of us was to eat healthier, quit smoking cigarettes, and start working out so as to limit the costs of our health care in the future. Since you'll be getting 5-year-old chemo from the government and current chemo for cash in the future. That's the personal responsibility that you can take. If anyone has any unrelated or related questions, I will take them now. Thank God and God bless. I want to go ahead and thank our sponsors, all of which disagree with one or more of my stands, pianobyangelo.com, Angelo Lambesis, who teaches and plays keyboards all over town for cocktail parties, holiday parties, anything. Zita, ZITA Design.com for all of your decorative painting needs. She can make anything look like anything. AustinAreaPlumbing.com for all of your plumbing needs. Tico Adventure Lodge, TICO AdventureLodge.com, a small hotel in Samara, Costa Rica. CNC Surf School in Samara.
All right.
As soon as they kick in the cash. La Vela Latina, a great sunset restaurant in Samara, Costa Rica. And Amhar Tequila. SantoSpirits.com, SANTO Spirits.com, an extremely smooth tequila. Thank you very much for your patience, and sorry about it being a late rant.